In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. Amen. In the day of our distress, we seek the Lord, was the response I chose for this particular psalm. And one of the things I do as a translator, is I have to also prepare the response, and it's pretty much a free hit. I can choose any of the verses in the whole psalm. And this time I chose verse 2a, as you can see, which in the Hebrew is, "In the day of my distress, I seek the Lord." But as is often the case, when we write the response, we change it to a plural. So in the day of our distress, we seek the Lord. Because the response is the congregation's, the gathered people of God's response to the psalm as it is read. And we always seek to do this as much as possible as a community gathered together rather than just individuals. So it's one of the interesting things about a translation, a project like this, is that you also have to think about what will the response be. And one of the interesting things about Psalms is that they're responsive, or as we say, antiphonal, through and through. We have, sometimes people think, we go to church, we have 4 readings each week. We have the Old Testament, the Psalm, the New Testament, and the Gospel. That's not actually true. We have 3 readings. We have the first reading, the second reading, and then the Gospel. And between the first and the second reading, the Psalm is chosen not as a reading, but as a response to the first reading. So the Psalm, in this case 77, is chosen as a response to the Elijah and Elisha story. And an international committee chose this a long time ago and put it in a thing called the Revised Common Lectionary. It's used by literally hundreds of millions of Christians around the world every Sunday. And so all around the world today, people who have had that particular first reading will be reading this particular psalm as a response to it. And so it's responsive first to the first part of the response of the psalm is that it is to the first reading, and then we say it responsorily. You'll notice that every single verse in the psalm, in the way it's laid out, there's a colon. So "Hear my plea is to God, so let me cry aloud, colon. My plea is to God, so may he hear me." And this is in every single verse. And it actually reflects the ancient, the Hebrew manuscript, where every single verse is divided this way as well. There's never 3 divisions, but there's always this symbol, first and second division. And in fact, the practice of chanting the Psalms, where the chant is in 2 lines, so that second line you would sing one sort of line for that first part, 1A as we would say, and sing a different melody for 1B, and then you'd repeat all the way through. Or in churches where it's read responsively, where the reader would read 1A and the congregation responds with 1B. This actually goes all the way back to Jewish practice in the synagogue of the reading of the verses in this antiphonal or this bipartite manner. And the thought is that Christian medieval chant from the medieval ages probably derived its practice originally from the Jewish practice itself, because these psalms are written in this manner, and also they have a system of accents in the Hebrew has a system of accents, and one of the theories about those accents is that it's a form of musical notation. We're not entirely sure, but that's a pretty strong theory. And if you ever listen or been to a synagogue, you'll know that they neither read or sing their scripture readings from the Hebrew Bible. They do what they call chanting, or technically leyening, Leyen, leyen, and the verb leyening. But which is neither speaking or singing, it's a form of chanting. And I highly recommend that you go to YouTube and just search Jewish synagogue chanting, Sabbath chanting of a psalm, and you'll hear the way they use a sort of the way the chant works is that there's a melodic little piece of melody for each of the accents on the Hebrew word. So this particular word may have an accent. One of the reasons we think there may be musical notations is that one idea is that the symbols, like one of them's like this, and it could have originally been a hand signal. So a particular accent we call a monarch goes like this, and then others are like that. And then some are a bit fancier, they're like a squiggle going up, and the fancier the accent, the fancier the melodic line. And so as you go along, you have all these melodic lines, and the reason the the chanters in the synagogues are so talented is that every single verse has a different combination of these melodic lines, and they sing it together so it comes out as a single melody, as it were. What's really fascinating is that the Ashkenazic Jews and the Sephardic Jews, which are the two sort of big divisions in Judaism, not theologically but culturally, they have their own separate traditions of musical chanting. So if you're well trained, you immediately know if you're listening to Ashkenazic Jews or Sephardic Jews in the synagogue, based on the melodic lines. One of the reasons we also think that the Jewish people and the Israelites originally had such amazing memorization of the scriptures is because they come with this melodic musical sense. And I've certainly spoken to Jewish colleagues in Old Testament or Hebrew Bible studies, as they would say, who've said if the moment they think of a verse, they hear the melody in their mind, and then they can recite the Hebrew. So the melody and the Hebrew go together, as it were. And so that's also an interesting thing, because we do know for a lot of reasons that the memory feats of the ancient Israelites and those who preserved our Hebrew manuscripts was really extraordinarily incredible. For instance, when they made a copy of the scroll, the person who would be responsible for writing transcribing the one scroll to the other could recite the entire thing from memory, like the whole Hebrew Bible we're talking about here, 66 books. They could recite it, and every time what they recited was slightly different to what was written, they'd put a note in the margin saying, "We say it this way, but it's written this way." And they knew, for instance, when they checked the scrolls, they would count every single letter in the scroll. So in the scroll of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the letter that occurs in the middle of, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of letters, is turned upside down. And then they would count every single letter up to that middle letter and every little after. And they knew the scroll had been copied perfectly if that letter there was the right number of letters on either side of it. And this was all done from memory. So an astonishing feat, and the musicality is part of that. So I'm telling you all this to help you understand that the very origin of the Psalms is musical, but not in the typical way we think of music, in this idea of chanting. It is words set to melodic lines that gives it a certain sort of feel and a rhythm. And that also the ancient practice, the church, modern church practice of this antiphonal, this sort of A-B, spoken response format, doesn't just come from the medieval church, where church musicians started to write these chants and the churches started to sing them. We believe they themselves come from synagogue practices, which themselves come from the text, which has this musical nature to it and this responsive nature to it. So this is one of the many factors I have to take into account as I'm translating the Psalms, is just this little thing, the response. And I thought I'd give you a little bit of an insight into that. As I said, this is not a typical sermon. These 7 weeks, I'm wanting to give you a bit of an insight. Just in this congregation, you're fortunate in a sense, or maybe not, to sort of hear a little bit more of the sort of the workings of it. People say, you never want to know how a sausage is made, you just want to eat the sausage. But I'm hoping this is a slightly different analogy, that you'll enjoy hearing about how this particular sausages were made. So you then can respond in the way we do it here. Of course, we have the cantor who sings that line, and then we respond in that way. So there's different ways of capturing that response. And also, just to note, it's different from the other readings, isn't it? Because that we participate in this, and we're responding to God, to one another, to the text, to the first reading. And you may also you may notice while we're talking about that in the church we stand for the gospel and not for the other readings. And you may think, why do we stand for the gospel? Well, theologically, there's 3 different reasons are given, and you can pick and choose. One idea is that we are standing to represent the fact that Jesus is standing with us in our midst. The other idea, the second idea, is that we stand because we want to say the words of Jesus, they're more important, they're more significant, they're more authoritative than all the other things we read. We have that first reading, the second reading, the response, and then the second reading. But we're going to stand just for the gospel. And so it's a way of indicating its priority, and of course also has the gradual hymn and a few other little fancy things to make it stand out. And it's also read from a different position. It's read here, or in some churches right in the middle of the people, to indicate its centrality symbolically. And the third reason people say is that we stand as a sign of our readiness to respond to this word. We may think we hear from Leviticus or from Paul or from Revelations that, wow, that's out there. But then when we hear the words of Christ, we think, okay, I'm going. That's the heart and soul. I want to follow that. Mind you, today's reading, you may not feel so keen to follow this word because it's a very difficult passage in the Gospels. And so I'm particularly glad not to be preaching on the Gospel today, but on the Psalm. So the other little thing, I'm going to do three things today. One is just talk about the response. The other thing, there's a couple of other reasons we think. The second thing, I'm going to talk about verses 16 to 18 and the musicality of the Psalms and the translation. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit of theology. Why not? Some theology. But the other thing about the musicality of the Psalms is that a lot of the Psalms actually have a musical heading. So this one in particular says, to the choir director, to music. Just let you in on a secret. We've got no idea what that word means. It just says in Hebrew to Jeduthun. Now, maybe it's some bloke down the side street who's selling, popcorn, but it's our best guess is that it's some sort of musical tune, maybe to the blues or jazz 12 bar or something. We don't know if it's a type of music or a particular tune. And then it also says a psalm of Asaph. And these superscriptions, you'll find them in your Bible, but typically not in the prayer book, and I think that's a great loss. It's one of the reasons we're trialling it. And if you do the survey for the trial, one of the questions is, have you found it helpful to have the superscriptions? Because it provides you a bit more context, and this one immediately tells you that this is something to be sung. It also says it's a psalm of Asaph, which I won't get into today, but it's one of the little collections of psalms within the book of Psalms. And the other thing you may have noticed on the verse 15, at the end of 15b, is this little word Selah, or Selah. And we also think that this is very likely to be a musical notation, that it was possibly a pause as the psalm was sung or chanted, but we're not entirely sure. It's a little bit riskier putting this in because I'm worried. I'm going to be really interested to see in the trial if anybody said the word Selah from the lectern, and because I decided not to send out instructions to say don't read out the Selah. I thought let's just see what happens because it is a bit more risky. Anyway, so that's musicality in our psalm today, and it's probably and responsiveness. But the other big part of musicality is the actual choices of the words. The way the translation process works is that every Friday I spend translating psalms. I'm very excited. 2 days ago I started on Psalm 23. I've been sort of terrified of doing that one. It's the most famous psalm in the world, one of the most famous texts in the world of any language. It's read at funerals typically. It's moving, it's evocative, and I didn't get past the second verse. But anyway, it's only 6 verses long, but hopefully next Friday I'll get my first draft. So I do the translation from the Hebrew original, just working from the Hebrew, and then I compare other translations, and then my first translation is a scholarly translation. You'd never want to read them. They're just horrible wooden things. And I checked the commentaries. I checked other modern translations, ancient translations going all the way back to like the 14th, 13th century, Tyndale, Coverdale if they're available, a King James Version, Dewey Rheims, Matthew Bible, Great Bible, Bishop's Bible. These are all the early Bibles that sort of fed into our modern English translations, although Coverdale does dominate via the King James Version, who adopted Coverdale. And then right through to modern. And I also like to read radical, wildly different modernised versions. I have this fabulous thing by this radical South American poet, regarded as probably as the greatest poet of his age in the 60s. Serrano, I think is his name. I'm not sure how you say it. And he would take the psalm and write them. He was in the midst of communist governments, and he'll use the word machine guns and labour unions and proletariat, and so they're cast in this sort of class struggle in the 60s in South America. And I have another one, for instance, from a fabulous feminist translator, where everything's female. God is El Shaddai, she pronouns. And I've read a couple of hers out in different sermons over the time, but it just allows me to think of the psalm often in a completely different manner. And then, so I do my draft out eventually after consulting all these things, and I send it to, we quote unquote, the first responders, who are 3 people who have made a commitment, and I'm very grateful for them, to respond immediately, like within a day or two. And 2 of them are musicians. One of them is Richard Black, whose response we sang today. Another one is Becky Llewellyn, another musician. And another one's a dear friend who previously was president of the Australian Poetry Society. She's a published poet. And they'll typically respond pretty quickly. I'm very interested in the musicality of the psalm, because often particularly the composers will say that you can't sing that, Matthew. Just the vowels there, or the this, that, and the other. There's not enough beats in the second line, things like this. Because if a psalm is easy to sing, then it's going to be easy to say. And it's a huge emphasis of my translation is that it rolls off the tongue, and that it's pleasant to listen to and easy to read. And I thought I'd illustrate that particularly with verses 16 to 18. Looking at the clock, I may just do 16 now. But 16 is interesting. So my version is, the waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you and seethed. Indeed, the very depths trembled. And the APBA, which is sort of our standard translation, which I'm always comparing to, the waters saw you, O God, so exactly the same. The waters saw you and were afraid. The depths also were troubled. So I said the waters saw you and seethed, and they have the waters saw you and were afraid. Then I have indeed the very depths trembled. They have the depths also were trembled. And a simple way you can test the musicalities, of course, is just to read these lines out 3 or 4 times in a row, and you'll discover some of the problems, particularly with that final verse of APBA. The depths also were troubled. The depths also. You've got the 2 front sibilant sounds, depths also, next to each other. And then when you start jamming sibilants together, so sibilants are S, T, Z, th, those sort of sh sounds in English. They're called sibilants because they're made by when we pass air quickly through a compressed area in the mouth. So s, where what we do is we put the tongue up on the top of the roof of the mouth, and we push the air through, and we make the s sound. Zzz, same thing, but it's voiced, so we make a sound with our throat. Tss, things like that. And they're lovely. And that's the sort of things in children's books are used with snakes and things that are skittering along and often are associated with nasty things. And so you've got to be careful with the sibilants too. But what you don't want is a whole bunch in a row, which is the whole point of, those things, those tongue twisters, the sixth sheiks, sixth sick sheep. I'm not even going to say the rest of it. It's regarded as the most difficult tongue twister in the world, that one. That's just the first line. The sick sheiks, sixth sick sheep. So here we have the problem is the depths also were troubled. The depths also were troubled. So I get around that by having indeed the very depths trembled. So you see I've just got one sibilant in mind. And the other thing is then in the previous verse where I actually add a sibilant, but this word seethed, which is a beautiful word. It's probably onomatopoeic, I should say. So onomatopoeia is where a word sounds like it is, like thump is something like bump. The word itself sounds like what's happening. So seethed, I don't know, to me it sort of feels a little bit like that. The waters saw you and seethed versus, I think this is a bit bland APBA, the waters saw you and were afraid. So that's the sort of thing that's happening in the discussion with the first responders, and then the second responders is a larger team. And then once a month we get together on a Zoom forum and we read out the draft. It's usually by that stage it's the second or third draft. We read out APBA, and then we read out, and often Kathy Teague, she's on the team from the cathedral. If you know Kathy, she was an English teacher I think she was an English. She certainly was a teacher and an educator, but she reads beautifully. So she reads APBA, and then she reads my translation. I know she likes my translation a lot, and I always think subconsciously she makes the APBA not sound so good, but I don't mind. Anyway, she reads it out to us if she's there, and then we listen, and often our responses are to what we hear. And in the history of translation, let me say, what you hear is often the most important thing. The most famous, beautiful example of this is that lovely, lovely story of Elijah, where there's the thunder and there's but God's not in the thunder. There's the wind, but God's not in the wind. There's the earthquake, but God's not in the earthquake. But God was in the still small voice. The still small voice. Do you know that passage? The still small voice. When the King James translators got together, because the King James translators, there was about 60 of them, they were in teams. When they got together, they read out to each other their translation, and they listened and they responded. And there's a famous story is that when it was read out, because the King James Version also is about 90% just copied Tyndale word for word, and in that particular phrase they had, and Tyndale and the first draft of that and the King James Version said, in the small still voice. God was heard in the small still voice. And one of the translators said, try that again, but say still small voice. It says God was heard in the still small voice. And they all went, yes, that was it, because they'd listened to it. So this is why so much good translation occurs when we listen. So I think this sounds lovely. The waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you and seethed. Indeed, the very depths trembled. Another tiny little note I just want to add in for fun is that in the APBA, they use two what we call stative verbs, were afraid, were troubled. A stative verb is when you say something about somebody, something about their state. Matthew is heavy. Peter is happy. Jonathan, we should have a female. Pat is happy. Pam is hungry. I don't know if that's true. And these are stative verbs. And you spot them in English because they had the verb to be before them. So here we have two, were afraid, were troubled. And stative verbs, the reason they're called stative verbs is they depict a state. It's just a continual thing. Like Matthew is hungry, and he'll be hungry until he eats, right? It's just this, or whatever. He'll be heavy until he's no longer heavy. And active verbs or transitive verbs, non-stative verbs are better to use. So I changed from were afraid to seethed, and were troubled to trembled. And so that's another little thing that we do when we're doing the translation. Oh, I want to talk so much more about the others, but I think I'm running out of time. You can have a look at 17 and 18 and compare them if you wish with APBA. There's lots of little changes to the English which I think helps it roll off the tongue. Like 18, your thunderclaps roared in the whirlwind, your lightning bolts lit up the world. The earth quaked and shook. I love that, your lightning bolts lit up the world. And I talked about sibilants. I can't not preach about liquids. So sibilants are the liquids are L, M, N, and maybe R in English as a semi-liquid sound. And they're called liquids because they sort of sound a bit more liquid. I don't know. Linguists made up that term, not me. And they're often associated with warmth and things like that. And but liquids are the most difficult sounds in English to make. So if you learn English as a second language, you'll find the letter R the most difficult of all to learn, and then L. Some people it's L and then R. And a lot of comedy shows make fun of people with foreign accents saying words with lots of liquids in them. And you may think you probably can bring some to mind, which I won't say. And the problem is, just like sibilants, you definitely want to avoid a bunch of liquids together. And APBA has in 18, your lightnings lit the world. Your lightnings lit. They have the LL sound like that, and then world is a shocker, because world itself is a difficult word. It's hard to sing, hard to say, because it has the R and the L followed by the stop D. Your lightnings lit the world. So I kept world, but I just popped in up after lit and changed lightnings to lightning bolts. So it just breaks it up a bit. Your lightning bolts lit up the world. And just that little addition of bolts and up, from your lightnings lit the world to your lightning bolts lit up the world, it rolls off the tongue. Okay, very, very briefly then, I'm only halfway through my notes. I'm so excited by this one. Theologically, look at 16 to 19. I've mentioned the Elijah story with the still small voice deliberately because that's a classic text. When clergy go on retreats, it's just all clergy. Imagine all clergy together. Just imagine a fair bit of wine and people sighing, and you've pretty much got a clergy retreat, about 90% men, unfortunately in our diocese, but that's pretty much what it is. So a lot of sighing, grumbling, and the spiritual director will often say, we've come away from the thunderstorms of parish life, and they all go, oh, the earthquakes of parish council, oh, another drink of the wine, the lightning bolts of pastoral crises, and pass me the Shiraz. And now we've come away and we're going to listen to the still small voice of God. And I want you to do a centering prayer. And you can just imagine it's gold for spiritual direction. And clergy lap it up once a year when we get together and I don't find pastoral care being like in a thunderstorm, by the way, but you can see what I'm getting at. So what's so fascinating about these verses is that it's pretty much the inverse idea, in that the thunder and the thunderclaps and the lightning bolts and the earthquakes is telling us about God. It's like saying God is here, God is there. Your lightning bolts, your thunderclaps, your lightning. Uses the your 3 times. Creation is saying, here's God in neon lights. And see how that's the opposite of that Elijah story? But then this crazy, mysterious twist in the tale in 19b, yet your footsteps were unseen. And it's like, what? It's like creation saying, here's God, here's God, here's God. Oh, wait, where's God gone? Your footsteps were unseen. And this reminds me so much of that duality I preached about last week, light and dark, joy and sadness, lament and thanksgiving. It's like God is here, God's everywhere. Oh, hang on, I can no longer find God. God's mystery. God is God's presence in creation is mysterious and sort of difficult. In fact, the best translation of this verse by far is the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, which says, your footprints were imperceptible. Isn't that gorgeous? Imperceptible. But you can know why I didn't use that in a liturgical translation, because everybody would be stumbling over imperceptible. The contemporary Jewish Bible has, your footsteps could not be traced. I love that too, but imperceptible. I just had, your footsteps were unseen. I think theologically this is so fascinating, and it tells us also that one part of Scripture will say God's like this and it appears like this, and this is what faith is, and another part will say it's actually the other way around. Job got it wrong, Deuteronomy says something different, or vice versa. And what's really cool about the Psalms is they usually do it in the same psalm. Remember last week, why so downcast, O my soul? Put your faith in God. So we had the downcast and hope in God. And the same thing here, we have this blasting 16 to 19a, waters seething, the depths are trembling, yet your footsteps are unseen. So this same paradoxical duality. I love the Psalms, I love the Scriptures, and hopefully something in that's also been spiritually innovating, if not linguistically stimulating. In the name of God, Amen.